It was a small town in the Sudetenland, and it was called in Trautenau in German and Trutnov in Czech. And it was, you could put your skis on in front of at the front door and ski right into the little hills in the surrounding. And that's what we would do often on, let's say, Wednesdays were half days at school. So that's when we often just skied from the house. And we went all to the same synagogue, And then I went to Vienna for a year or two and went what was called the Handelshochschule, which is actually in the business college. And Harry Lewis, he and I went to the same Handelshochschule. My grandmother was arthritic, rheumatic, and she then went to a place called Teplitz. Teplitz, where people went to treat rheumatism. And Francistown was just half an hour or less drive away. And each time I was there, he came. And then I'll never forget, he took me up one day on the mountain, and he had such a big trench coat, and that was new to me, and it was very cold, and he took the trench coat off and put it around me. And that's something I'll never forget. It was wonderful. And that's how I met him, and we then went out together. And that's how I came to be with him. Yes, what we call now an attorney, yes, and he had a very big practice, and he pleaded as well in Czech as in German, and went all the way to the High Court, etc. That was when we were in a town called Brux. In Czech it's Most. And I had my name entered in the hospital there, but due to subsidence, of the chimney went over like the Tower of Pisa, and so I couldn't have the children in the hospital. I had both children at home. We decided to leave, and what happened actually, one night we got a phone call. He hated the phone. I never had it. We never, to my husband's chagrin, he didn't allow me a phone in the house. So if I got a phone call, the neighbors had to come and tell me that would I come and speak to whoever was phoning me. And there was this sudden phone call, and we didn't know where from, that we should leave. So we packed things and left at night and went to Prague, where my parents were in Hotel Steiner, and got breakfast there. And that's how we got actually out. We never went back again. But then my husband's sister, a wonderful woman, went back and got and hired, managed to get some lorries and got a whole lot of furniture onto those lorries and got them back out. And that's how we actually, it's so funny, I have all the books of the all the furniture, everything from the old country. You wouldn't believe it that it all got rescued due to my sister-in-law's cleverness. We came by train And Diana, my elder daughter, used to call it when we lived in the train. When we lived in the train, and I can't still understand it today. We seem to be the only occupants in that train which went to Karlsbad and to Karlsbad then. And so, and it was so funny when they said women and children first to come out of the train into out onto wherever one was going, and I didn't go. And they shoved me and said, "Why?" Well, as a Jew, I couldn't go first. So one was quite brainwashed that way, you know. My father, having been a linen merchant, had among the Jewish community friends in the community, and that's how we became. Then we were put in charge of a place called the Refugee Settlement Farm in Milail. Actually, the farm was worked only by our own people. They had to learn how to use a tractor, etc. And we spent quite a few years there, and out of a cow shed we had a lovely room then, and divided by a gingham curtain in two, and the one half was kind of living area, and the other half was a bedroom area. There were three groups. The one, there were the children, like there were only my own were the two youngest. The one below, I think 8 or something, and then were the next group. They were the teenagers, and they were preparing to go to Israel as chalutzim. You know what a chalutz is? As working teenagers. And then there were quite a few adults as well. And they built eventually an additional building where there were some single rooms where people who didn't belong to either could have a room to themselves. Actually, there were what was called friendly aliens and enemy aliens. And the friendly aliens were those from Czechoslovakia and Poland, etc. And the enemy aliens were those from Germany and Austria. And Francie and I were the only friendly aliens, because coming from where we were considered friendly aliens. He was in charge of admin, more or less. And Mr. Solomon was did the finances, but he and Mr. Solomon worked together, and he would go to Belfast to get whatever was necessary from there to bring back. And he was really admin. Actually, you know, people think I would have been unhappy because no money, no nothing. In my memory, it was a happy time. One made nice friends, and one was able to visit them, and they visited us, and then eventually one came, what's that next town, to Milail, I forget the name now, and our bank was there, and Francie had to go to lodge checks, etc. So the people one met then became friends forever. Now, in retrospect, there were 17 members of my family and Francis' families who perished in the Holocaust. You know, cousins and uncles, and all we know is they did not survive it. Nor did my husband's mother, nor my grandmother, you know. We were very, very lucky. And as I say, in a way, I remember it as a happy time.
I can't remember getting there. I just know that I was lucky enough to get there with my parents and my sister, and the people who got there were lucky enough too. And I remember little farm things because I was very young, but to me I was on a farm, living in a cow byre and playing with the other children. Well, mostly there weren't that many our age. There was Max, who was about maybe 10 or 11, and then a few other older ones, but I just remember playing in the barn and living in the cow byre, and then going to the school eventually and going to the hens and getting the eggs out from under them, and country life really, I suppose. Oh, I was a happy bunny, yes, it was lovely. I mean, I was scared of the big animals sometimes, and sometimes things went wrong, but mostly it was, I loved it there, and it was lovely, yes. Well, I think I must have been nearly just about 3 years old. Princess Gardens was evacuated to Carradore Castle, which was a small castle just on the way to Ballywalter, to Carradore actually. And because we had to go to a nearby school, that was the only one. And Daddy, I think, taught violin there, as far as I remember. And I had a very early start to school, because my sister was older and she was going anyway. And I was a naughty wee girl in school. I remember being told to stand in the corner and stuff like that. And I remember the other children all had little tuck boxes for their lunch, and they had Mars bars and chocolates, and I had radishes and carrots and bits of celery in mine. I didn't speak anything, I think, except Mama and Dada at the beginning, because I didn't have the power of language, I think, that much. I had a few Czech words and a few German words, probably. But I grew up learning English. I remember I once split my head right across the middle with the corrugated edge of the low barn wall, and Dr. Jacobi had to come to the little cow shed where we lived and put loads of plaster on my head. I also remember one time when we were in there and the cows were going and the calves were going along the middle bit to their new barn, they sort of took the wrong turn and went back into the old one, and our whole front room was filled with cattle. Things like that, but it was just farm life. It wasn't holiday or not holiday. School was just bits that I did in between. And I had lots of lovely friends in school, and friends from nearby Malile and Donaghadee that we played with. I mean, there was a woman who sewed for us, a lovely lady, and her kids, they had lived in a converted railway carriage in Malile, and I used to go and play with them and stay with them during the day and enjoyed their company. So I had a great life. There were arrivals, all right, and Daddy set up nights trying to sign papers to get them in. And it's all a bit of a blur from that point of view. There were people who came, and we were the only ones who stayed and never actually left the country again.
I had a very happy childhood with my sister and my very loving parents. Vienna never recovered financially between the two wars, and money was always tight. But in the street it was a common sight to see invalids begging or selling matchsticks or something like that. And I always thought that the state was very shabby to the people who had suffered during the war. At school, We had mixed classes but separate religious instruction. But I didn't befriend non-Jewish children, or better said, they didn't befriend me. And socially, I only played with my sister and my cousin, and with nobody outside the home. That was self-understood. There was a large, I would say 200,000 Jews in Vienna, all kinds of shades of Jews. But we were not at all Orthodox, we were very liberal. We kept the serious holidays. My mother took us to the synagogue, but we didn't keep a kosher house at all. Well, I had piano lessons as a teenager. I read very much. There was a library next door to where we lived, and I exchanged my own books. And I particularly like to read foreign language books, English and French, which helped me in later life a lot. And of course, I tried to go to concerts and the opera as much as possible, as much as my finances allowed. I got dinner money and I didn't use it, and used it for tickets to go to the opera or to a concert. I just got by at school. Of course, also we went skiing in the winter, and skating, and playing tennis and swimming in the summer. That was a natural thing in Vienna. All children did a lot of sport. I was learning the piano from the age of 6, and my real ambition was to become a concert pianist like my teacher was. But then when I was 15, the financial situation in the family was so that I had to think of earning my own money as quickly as possible, and I decided I want to go into the hotel business because I knew the languages, and so I entered into the Gastwirteschule, school for caterers, and there I went in the mornings, and in the afternoon I went to a commercial school. And that lasted for 2 years, and at the end of the second year, a friend of the family sent me to another friend of the family, and this friend sent me to the director of the world-famous Hotel Bristol in Vienna. And I was accepted as a volunteer, which meant I could work there without any pay, but I got my meals. And that was very interesting, and it lasted for a year. And at the end of the year, I was taken on to the staff. So I was, that was in 1932, and I stayed there until March 1938, when due to Hitler, I was dismissed instantaneously. I got a paper which said, dismissed, reason, Jewish. So at that time, I was already married, and I was expecting a baby. And my director, when he saw me in the hotel on Monday morning, said, "What are you doing here? You have no more job. Quickly go home." So there was nothing else I could do, and I started to knit for my mother's shop. She had a wool shop, and I knitted sweaters for other people and tried to make some money that way. And my husband was dismissed at the same time from his job in the radio factory, where he worked as a radio engineer. And then we thought, what are we going to do? And he suggested we write to customers of the firm where he worked for, if they would have a job for him. And the only positive or halfway positive answers we got from Estonia. And the people said, well, one director wrote, maybe we'll have a job, maybe. And as it happened, Estonia was the only country in the whole world that didn't require a visa for entry. At the same time, we also applied for a visa for Australia. And, but of course, we knew that would take a long time to come through, if at all. And the situation was getting worse in Vienna because people were made to scrub the pavement, and innocent people were arrested and taken to camps. And the two directors of the hotel where I had been working, they were the first to be arrested, and it turned out that most of the staff were already illegal Nazis and took over all the jobs in the hotel. In September 1938, it looked very much like a war starting, and I arranged a family get-together and said, what do you think, should Kurt leave Vienna quickly? And everybody said yes, he should go as quickly as possible. Then I asked Kurt, my husband, do you want to go alone or shall we go together? And he said, we go together. Okay. So I went to the Austrian Airlines and bought return air tickets to Tallinn in Estonia. And within a week, we were on our way. Each a small suitcase, 10 German Reichsmark was all the money everybody was allowed to take. And at the airport, there was a thorough search of the luggage and even of the baby, if we had hidden anything in the nappies of the baby. So we got on the plane, and it was our first flight, and we enjoyed it very much. We arrived in Estonia, and because we had returned tickets, they accepted us as tourists. That was on the 28th of September, the day when Mr. Chamberlain went to talk to Adolf Hitler in Munich. And the next morning we heard already on the radio in the lobby of the hotel when Chamberlain had peace in our time. Through this new friend who had picked us up at the airport, he was introduced to another owner of a smaller radio factory, and he got a job within a week. And also, the lady arranged that one of her friends let us live in his dacha, which is a summer house in the country, for free, because she said we shouldn't stay under the eye of the police in town. It is safer to be outside. So we moved into the country, not speaking the language of the land, hardly any money. And it was still September, but we had the one room. In this room, we were sleeping, eating, cooking, looking after the baby. Everything was in one room. And I started knitting for people to make a little bit of money. And my father, who had stayed behind in Vienna, he sent us parcels and parcels with very important things, including a baby pram and cooking utensils and bedding and all sorts of things. He really worked terribly hard under difficult circumstances to help us out abroad. We had to apply every 3 months for extension of our visa. And my husband said, you go. They don't understand me, they understand you better. That was my whole life, that was you go, you do it. When the Baltic states lost their independence, that I remember I had already a second child by then, little Walter, and we had our first flat of our own in the country, and I heard all these planes overhead, and when I looked up, they were all having the Soviet star. And I started crying because I remember when the planes with the swastikas were over Vienna, and that was the end of Austria, and I thought, now, well, that's the end of Estonia. And so it was. Our friends, they lost their house, their factory, everything at once. And they had to move to some move in with other people. At night we listened to the BBC very low so that nobody else could hear it because it was strictly forbidden. So we had some information what was going on in the outside world. We lived quite normally, even under the Russians, although the shops were soon emptied of all their merchandise. But then a friend of mine said, I can give you a button-making machine, and you will see you will make so much money that you can afford a home help to look after the children. So I started making cloth buttons. I knew enough of the Estonian language to go to dressmakers and collect my orders and deliver my orders. And I made quite a lot of money. My husband helped me at night because he worked during the daytime, and we had sometimes so many orders that we worked both through the night to complete our orders. Well, one morning I looked out of the window and I saw a lorry across the road, and the people loaded onto the lorry and suitcases and big commotion, and then they departed. And then my husband came home from work and said, imagine, my boss has been arrested and he's being sent away. So I immediately thought of our friends and I tried to go to their houses. And I was already too late. They had already been deported as well. So I met one of the daughters and we went to the harbor where the cattle trucks were waiting full with people ready to be shipped to the east. And after a long search, we found my friend, and she said what medicine she has forgotten, and I got her then the medicine and some photographs and the watch. But we never found the husband. He was, because the men were in a separate cattle truck, and I never found him. The night after our friends had been deported, I heard steps on the staircase, wooden staircase, and I thought, well, that's our turn. And my heart nearly stopped. But then it wasn't our turn, it was the neighbor's turn. He was an officer in the Estonian army, and that was another crime, so he was arrested. But my husband and I, we decided we must prepare ourselves, and we started packing and thought what we would need if they take us. And sure enough, in the afternoon, an Estonian officer with 2 Russian soldiers came to the house. And he said, pack everything that you will need to live for a whole year. So I didn't need another instruction. I packed just absolutely everything, bedding and cooking utensils and foodstuff that we had stored, and mainly also everything I needed for the 2 babies I had. One was a year and the other one was 3 years. So in the end, we had 17 boxes, bundles, suitcases ready to take away. Then came a IRA alarm, and we sat in the dark waiting. And then when the alarm was cancelled, the officer ordered a lorry. And the lorry came and they loaded all the 17 parcels and boxes, etc., onto the lorry. And then my husband and I, we went with the children up, sitting on our worldly goods. I had the baby and he had the girl. And we departed for our first internment camp, which was beside the prison. And there we experienced our first Russian banya, going, you get a bucket of hot water and you pour it over yourself, and that's your banya. And when I wanted to go to the toilet, You can't go, you have to wait until there are enough people ready to go for an escort. So that really drove it home to me that I was a prisoner, that I wasn't free to do as I wanted to. I cannot remember how I managed with the babies without hot water, without washing facilities. We were in the first camp only about 10 days because the Germans advanced so quickly that the Russians wanted to get us further east. So I was allowed to travel in the Black Maria with the children, which was very frightening because it was completely dark and you didn't know how long the journey would be and where it would leave it off. But eventually they opened the Black Maria and we were beside the train with the cattle trucks, and we all had to go into these cattle trucks, and there were bunks on each side and a little stove in the middle and a hole in one corner, and that hole in the floor that was supposed to be the toilet. So we settled down there and then the train left. The doors, of course, closed. And there was only a very small window at the top where so there were double bunks, and the one in the top bunk could just look out through the grill there. And I was able to look out. I always tried to be in the top bunk with the children. All of a sudden I saw that the train stopped and the soldiers ran into the woods. And a couple of minutes later there was a bomb dropped on our train. The German planes came and attacked our train. One wagon was completely destroyed. Only one man and his son survived. The others were all killed or badly injured. And then came a man and he opened all the doors and we ran into the woods. After a while, the Russians wanted us to come back to the train. But one woman and her daughter, they were never found. They were Germans, and probably they thought they would have a better future staying and waiting till the Germans were coming. But we had to go back to our train, and one woman who spoke good Russian, she started singing a song which was very popular in Russian, but it was really cheeky because it said, "I don't know another country where people live as freely as here." And when the soldiers heard that song, they got furious and smashed the door closed again. Well, that journey took 4 days with very little food and hardly anything to drink. It was terribly hot in July, and the food was salt fish and dry bread. And it was a very hard journey, 4 days. No washing facilities, etc. But eventually we stopped and we had to walk to a monastery which had been turned into a prison of war camp. At first it wasn't too bad. There was no forced labor. Some people worked voluntarily in the kitchen or in the bathhouse because that meant they got a little bit extra bread. So then one day there was a decree that the hair of all the children had to be shorn off completely because they were afraid of the lice. And my children, they looked like tadpoles. Big eyes and nothing else. The worst thing was, and it got very cold, there was every morning and every evening was roll call. You had to stand in the freezing cold and rain or snow, whatever it was, until the numbers were all complete, and they made mistakes and they had to start from the beginning again. It was really atrocious. So one day, it was again, pack up, we go further east. again into the cattle trucks, and we ended up in a town called Gorky. Gorky was the former Nizhny Novgorod. Gorky, there again we went to the bath, and an old man was ladling out the hot water, and you couldn't care less if you were naked or not, as long as you could get a decent wash. And I could bath the children. One woman's dress was dropped into the disinfection fire and destroyed, and the woman had been arrested in just what she was standing up in, so she had nothing, but somebody gave her a dress to wear. She was in hysterics, the poor person. We traveled to the to the next one in Aktyubinsk, and the train stopped in the middle of a snow field, and we were just told, walk in this direction. You couldn't see anything, but I had the baby on my arm and my little girl on my hand, and slowly we trudged through the snow. And when I saw a tower, I knew I was going in the right direction, a lookout tower. And when we arrived there, we were led into a room, and the floor was full of people. And somehow we managed to find a little corner to settle down on the floor. What had happened was that the leader of this camp had been told, expect 300 refugees. But he wasn't told that half were women and children and half were men. And he wasn't prepared for the women, so he got a shock, and he put a barbed wire on the center of the camp and sent the men to their barracks and the women to the other half that wasn't really prepared. So we had to wait 2 days or so until she had our barracks ready for us. So in Aktyubinsk, we settled down on our double-tiered bunks, and by pure chance, I met a woman with a child who had known from Vienna, and her child was the same age as mine. And we decided we would stay together, sleep next to each other, which was good because the children could play and we could have some conversation, mostly complaining about our husbands. But then later on, the spring came, and we decided one day she would take the children, look after them, and I would go to voluntary field work. And the next day we would swap around, because first of all, you got extra food when you worked, and secondly, you got out of this by now really stinking quadrangle of the prison camp. But before that happened, my son developed a high fever, and the doctor said he had scarlet fever. I don't understand how he, the only child in the whole camp, could get scarlet fever without being in touch with anyone outside, but it was true. So they said I had to take him to the hospital. And I wrapped him up warm and covered him, and we went to the hospital. And they did keep the child at the hospital, and I didn't make any fuss because I thought they will look after him, and I have the other child in the camp, so I went back. About 6 or 8 weeks later, I didn't hear anything from the child, except one soldier. He came occasionally and said, I've seen your boy, I've given him the biscuit, he's all right. I didn't believe him, but that's what he said. But then I really got impatient, and I went to the officer in charge and said, why is my child not coming back? We can't take him back because all his clothes were burnt in the disinfection stove. I said, I don't care for the clothes, I want the child back. And luckily I had so much I could give him a completely new outfit. And gave it to him, and he sent a nurse to the hospital, and 2 days later they brought my son back. Their head bandaged and as thin as a newly born baby. No, he couldn't even sit, never mind stand. He could stand before that. When my husband saw him, that was the one and only time that I saw him crying, because the child was in such a terrible condition. And he cried every night. As soon as I put my head down on the pillow, he started crying. And I had to walk with him from wall to wall and wall to wall, or else he would start crying again. And then a woman went to the officer in charge and said, we can't sleep, the child doesn't give us any peace. And he called me and he said, what's the matter? Why is the child crying? I said, the child is crying because it is hungry. I can't feed him on salt fish and dry bread. So he took me to the storeroom and said, here, have a kilo of noodles and a kilo of semolina and cook for your child. So the woman wanted to do me in, but she really did me a favor. But it took a whole year before the boy was back to normal, what he had been before he took ill. I often wonder how I kept those children busy and happy. I know I made a rattle out of a string with buttons on it, but that was about all. I don't know how they survived. I couldn't let them out in the cold winter because they had not the shoes and clothing for the outdoors. But they were very good. They were just sitting there on their bunk. I don't know. Ever so often a Russian political instructor came and read us from the paper. But in the winter of 42, the situation was very, very bad for the Russians. And there were some people who could understand and they could translate for the other people. And so we had some idea what was going on. But the food was atrocious, and that was definitely the worst winter of all, from 42 to 43. I was always optimistic. I thought the war must end one day and then we'll be sent home. I never lost completely hope. And I always continued to learn. I took Spanish lessons. I had a lot of French conversation with one of our neighbors on the bunks. And well, that was French, and had English conversation. I never gave up. Well, then came the spring, and before that the men were sent to another camp, and when my husband came back, he was on crutches, and I thought, that's terrible. He had stepped on a rusty nail, and that caused him to have a thrombosis, and he had to not to put any weight on that leg, and he was on crutches. But the fact that he was an invalid later on saved his life, because in the next camp, the men were sent to a very, very hard labor camp, and an awful lot of young people died there because the work was very hard and the food was very bad. And my husband couldn't be sent because he was an invalid, so he was spared this danger. Looking back, he would have thought to be interned was a catastrophe. But looking back, I know that the Russians saved our lives, because if we had not been evacuated by them, we wouldn't be alive now, because the Germans didn't leave one Jew alive in Tallinn. When it was announced over the radio, there was radio all over the camp that the war was finished. Oh, wonderful, we'll go home. I said, don't fool yourself, you're not going home. You have to pay back for what you cost us all these years. You'll have to work and stay here for another time. That was in May 45. When we actually got away, it was January 47. In the meantime, before all that happened, I had another baby in the camp. The first to go home were the Germans and the French. And from September on, in 46, I started knitting for my family. And I used the wool that came from Japanese prisoners of war who were glad to exchange their warm woolies for a piece of bread or something like that. Well, the journey back was then 63 days, with a small interval in a camp in Hungary, where we were under the supervision of German prisoners of war, and we felt that was really the biggest insult. But it was only for 2 days. When we came back to Vienna, it was a very, very sad town. All the houses had damage, and the shops were absolutely empty. You couldn't buy a spool of thread or anything. I used ripped out socks for sewing thread, also in the camp, of course. I was thinking the other day so much about recycling. I was recycling all my life, even in Vienna. My mother from the First World War, she was one for recycling. And in the camp, every button, every press dot, every zipper was preserved. Nothing was thrown out. On the train journey from Russia to Vienna, we stopped at the border of Romania because there the train had to change. In Russia, the gauges of the rails are wider than in Europe. And I said to Kurt, look, we have a 5-pound note hidden in a ball of wool. I think we should use that now and try and send a telegram to your family in Northern Ireland. They had lived there since 1939. So we composed a very short telegram and gave it with a 5-pound note to a perfect stranger on the platform of that station. And the telegram arrived, which was really a miracle. I mean, the man could have pocketed the 5 pounds and finished, but he was a very decent man. So my in-laws, and through them my mother and sister in London, knew that we were on our way. And when we arrived eventually, after we had to wait another half year in Vienna for the visa for England, and we arrived in England, I would say exactly 9 years after we had left Vienna, 38-47.
I was born in Berlin on the 2nd of May 1920. My father in those days had a country practice in a little village away from Berlin. And I spent part of my time there, and my education took place in Potsdam. I had 2 sisters, both older than I. I went to elementary school and then went to grammar school because I intended to follow in my father's footsteps and become a doctor. Unfortunately, once Hitler came into power, I was thrown out of grammar school and ended up another year in the elementary school before I left school altogether. I left school in 1934 and went to an apprenticeship in engineering. That was in Berlin. My father died in 1935. He'd been ill for a number of years, had to stop practicing, and so we lived in Potsdam. I completed my apprenticeship, and by some quirk of fate, I still managed to pass my technical, practical, and theoretical exams in 1938. We were forbidden to do certain things. You weren't allowed to go to a cinema or a theatre. You weren't allowed to sit on a park bench. And in fact, a lot of places just simply said in German, Juden unerwünscht, Jews prohibited. I had school friends while I was still at school. Once I went to work, there weren't any. I worked in the same firm, which oddly enough, it was a firm by the name of Walter Kalman. The man was Jewish, an ex-senior officer in the German army from the First World War, and because he had certain patents which involved work for the German army that was coming into being, I stayed there. You couldn't make plans. You knew that sooner or later the Gestapo would come. There was absolutely no way of knowing when. Well, a message came through to the office one day. I was wanted on the phone. It was a fairly big factory. And I went to the phone and it was my sister. And she told me in coded words that the Gestapo had been to the house. We had a code between my sister and myself. Well, it was a code. If the Gestapo had been, my sister would say, Uncle has been visiting. And I was told on the phone that Uncle had been visiting, and I immediately decided to disappear. And I went into hiding from work, went into hiding in the forest of West Berlin. And I was there for 2 days. And the only place, and the only one who knew where I was my sister. And she came to find me and said, they've been, and if you don't give yourself up, they're going to arrest Mother. I had no option. So I immediately went back, and by mental telepathy, they knew I was back. And within the hour, they were at our house. I put the handcuffs on and taken away to SS headquarters, Gestapo headquarters. Well, I was there till, 3 or 4 days. And then we were there were others who had also been collected, and we were all put on a bus. And our next stop was Sachsenhausen concentration camp, which is near Berlin. We had no idea what was going to happen to us. Once we arrived at the camp, we had to run the gauntlet between 2 ranks of SS guards who gave us a good beating. And then we were taken to the store, given prison uniform. My number was 13174. And they cut our hair off. And they were prisoners. A lot of the people who were there with me were also from Potsdam, from the same community, same congregation. I knew quite a lot of them. And of course, they knew me. I'd grown up there. In those days, they didn't arrest or intern women. Well, we were taken to various, we called them blocks, the Nissen huts, or something, the German equivalent. And we were very, very tightly packed. We slept on the palliasse on the floor. And food, I wouldn't say it was non-existent, but it was very, very, very poor. Very poor indeed. We went on to forced labour. They were building a factory. To this day, I don't know what they were building, but it was a huge, big factory. And being young and pretty strong, I had to carry bags of cement from a river barge to the building site. But in those days, you didn't carry one bag, you carried two, one on each shoulder. And as soon as you dropped them, you had to run back to the barge and get loaded up again, carry them, drop them at the building site, and this went on all day. There was an unfortunate case of one of our prisoners. I knew him well. And he had spoken to one of the gang foremen, or gang leaders, if you like, who were in fact habitual criminals. And they were in the camp because they were habitual criminals. And he happened to say that he had managed to get himself an easier job. And the particular man who was in charge of us went up to him with a spade and split him right in the middle. It's difficult to understand, but from head right down to the shoulder. That was the price he paid for trying to get a better job. You couldn't win. If people became ill, lots of us got frostbite because we were now in the winter of 38 and it was very, very cold. And of course we had no coats. We had a jacket and trousers and a shirt and a cap, and it didn't keep the cold out. We used to try and get hold of an empty cement bag and put it under our jacket to keep warm. And when they found out we were doing that, they stopped it. Well, once a week, we were very, very fortunate. They gave us a little chunk of whale meat. Other than that, it was a vegetable soup of a sort. It was produced in our cookhouse in very, very vast quantities, and every block or Nissen that we were in had a man who was in charge. He was a political prisoner, and he would nominate 2 people to go to the cookhouse and come back with a container of this soup. That was our food, a piece of bread. There was an occasion when a prisoner escaped, a man by the name of Mahler, and they caught him again. And he was marched back into the camp in front of the whole assembled camp, carrying a big bass drum and on it had said, "I'm back." And he was marching to the center of the parade square, put over what we called the buck. It was a sort of a structure to tie a man down in a kneeling position, and they flogged him to death in front of us. You were in a no-win situation. Well, for a short while, for a week, I was put onto the recovery squad. The camp was surrounded by electrified wire. In front of it was a path, and the warning signs said, if you step on that path, you'll be shot from the watchtowers. And during the night, some prisoners decided to end it all and walked into the wire and were electrocuted. And during the morning, the recovery squad had to go round the camp perimeter with a trolley. The electricity was switched off, and we had to lift the dead people from the trolley, from the wire onto the trolley, and take them to the crematorium. I was in the camp from September until March 1939. We came back from work, we had the roll call, and suddenly they called 13174. So I stepped forward, at the double, of course. I'm told to stand by the gate whilst the rest of the camp was finally dismissed. And I got my own clothes back and I put into a cell. There was a prison inside the camp. And the man in charge of the prison was a man whose name was very, very well known. He was a minister of religion, Pastor Niemöller, who was a U-boat commander during the First World War, and then became a minister. And he was in the camp as a prisoner. And first thing in the morning, he gave me a cup of coffee. And this was on March the 23rd. And two SS officers came, put my handcuffs on, took me back to the administration office, gave me a document which said that I had not been ill-treated, that I had been well-treated, and that I would not disclose to anyone what I had seen or what had taken place in the camp. And when I looked up, there was a pistol pointed at me. Said, "Are you going to sign?" Obviously I did. And I was taken to a prison van, a Black Maria, which is divided into little cells, and we drove off in the deep snow. I had no idea where we were going. And finally we ended up in Potsdam. And I was taken to the Gestapo headquarters, and they said to the Gestapo, "Is he going back or is he staying?" And they said, "No, he's staying." So they took the handcuffs off and disappeared. And I was put into solitary confinement for about 4 or 5 days. Again, I had no idea what was going to happen. And then they took me downstairs to the office and said, listen carefully, you have until April the 15th to get out of Germany. If you're not out, you will be rearrested and we will throw away the key. And so I was released and walked home to my mother. My mother had gone Snow White, and we had a wonderful reunion. I've got to admit, shamefully, I got drunk that night. And it was so wonderful to see my mother again. I had about a week to do something, because if the Gestapo said, my limit is the 15th of April, that was it. So I went to Berlin and went to the British consulate. And, well, they could see from my haircut where I had been. And I told them that I had just come out of Sachsenhausen and that I've got to be out of Germany by April the 15th. They then agreed to give me a trainee permit. This permit would allow me to stay in Britain for 18 months. And then I would have to emigrate to one of the colonies, which we had in those days. And so I went home. I managed to get a passport. And on the 12th of April, I left my mother, my sisters, at the railway station in Berlin, on my way to Hamburg to join the ship that would take me to Britain. We kept in touch, of course, and I still have the last letter that my mother wrote through the Red Cross to me. I've still got that. I treasure it very, very much indeed. Mother stayed in Potsdam. Both of my sisters had married in the meantime, and she stayed with one of my sisters. And then a transport was arranged, and my mother was called to report for this transport. She was taken to Riga, where she was ultimately executed by being shot in the head. I know this because after I came out of prison, I met someone who knew me and had known me for many, many years, who somehow had survived the Holocaust and was in the same camp as my mother. And she remembers the day, April the 14th, 1942, when mother was marched through an open grave and shot.
And your sisters?
My eldest sister had disappeared with her husband and lived undercover on an assumed identity. And my sister Rita The younger one of the two was deported to Theresienstadt and ultimately used for experimental purposes. There is no known grave. When I left, the boat took me to France, and from France we crossed over the channel to Southampton, and in Southampton I travelled up to London, and I then reported on that was a Saturday, and on the Sunday I reported to Bloomsbury House, which was the reception centre for refugees. And they said, right, where do you want to go? I said, but I'm an engineer. I want to work in my profession. And for I don't know what reason, I said, Liverpool. I've never been to Liverpool in my life. I'd never been to England in my life. I couldn't speak English. So they said, right, we will give you a one-way ticket, Euston, Lime Street, Liverpool, and you're on your own. And so on the Monday morning, I travelled on the train to Liverpool. I left my suitcase in the left luggage and looked up addresses of engineering firms. That much I knew in English. And I found one, and I went to them, and in my broken English told them I was an engineer. Would they give me a job? And they took me to the factory and gave me a job to do, which I did. It was some electric welding. And they were satisfied. And they said, next week you start. Learn some English. And so I started work the following week until war was declared. As an alien, I had to register as an enemy alien, and consequently, I was arrested and interned. Travelled all over the country from one camp to another until we eventually ended up in Whitchurch, Shrewsbury. And there they said, you can join, you volunteer for the army once we've checked you out. So it took a while, and one day they called our names and said, right, you're joining up. And it's a bit comical, really. We travelled on a lorry from Whitchurch to Shrewsbury. We were sworn in and received what is known as the King's Shilling. The guards took the bayonets off their rifles, unloaded their rifles, and come, we're going to have a pint. And we then travelled to Ilfracombe, which was the Alien Pioneer Corps headquarters, and we were put into uniform and became soldiers. I was transferred to the Royal Engineers and became 193-1667. Sapper. This sort of thing stays with you for the rest of your life. You can't forget it. I've seen too much of things which I will not talk about to anyone. I never have and I never will. But I've seen too much to forget what took place. In our camp when I was a prisoner, there were fatalities all the time. But it was nothing like Auschwitz. And when I knew about Auschwitz, Belsen, I was just horrified. And to this day, I can't bring myself to speak German or to speak to Germans. My motto is, lest we forget.
In 1911, my father went out to America, and my mother followed him out in 1913, and they were married there. And then the First World War broke out, and my father went up to Canada and joined the Canadian Army, and was in France, and came back to America again. And I was born in 1920, and I was there for 5 years when my father and mother decided to come home again. So I came home then in 1925, and that's how I have an American passport. I kept it, hoping that someday some of my family might want to go to the States, and it would help them. So the youngest boy just went, and it helped him to get there. I've been in Belfast from 1925, except for the war years, for 3 years. Married a Belfast girl, 1942. At the beginning of the war, I joined up in the ARP here, and was here during the air raids. I was on the Ravenhill Road then, and during the whole Blitz, there was an operation here. And then when I got my draft card from America, they were starting to look for Navy personnel. So there was no way I was going to join the Navy, and I volunteered for the Army. And I joined up in Belfast, and I was stationed down in the Grove, in the Shore Road, for about 6 weeks before I was shipped over to England for training. When I took my training in Tidworth, and then I was shipped into France, and I was put into a replacement centre. That was for the holding centre till they were shipping on into divisions. And the division that I joined had just came from the States under strength, and I joined them in Strasbourg. And it was about a week in Strasbourg before we were put on the line. Some of the divisions are state divisions, but the Rainbow was taken from all over the United States, and that was the reason they called it the Rainbow. All hues and creeds and colours was in it, and that was the reason it was called that. There was only one other lad in it, was from Scotland, and he was in the same company. The two of us was put into the one company, and that's the only guy I knew, and amongst all the strangers. From Strasbourg, we went on to the line in the Harz Mountains, and we dug in there, and we're there for quite a while, and it was just patrolling. We'd done patrols, and that was all. And then when they started the big push, they started, and it took us about 2 days to get out of the mountains, and then we hit the Siegfried line then, went through it. Actually, we were fighting most of the time over there, only for maybe a few days to pull us back and give us a bit of a rest. But then we hit the Siegfried line and went through it, and then onto the Rhine. But we were fighting all the time. The point was they didn't want to keep the Germans get organised. They wanted to keep them on the run. So we were as bad as them, moving all the time. Front line, yes. Most of the time, not time we're put into reserve, but most of the time we're at front line. And then went through, after we crossed the Rhine at Worms, and then went through, well, through Wurzburg, Schweinfurt, Nuremberg, right down to Dachau. And we were fighting all the time and on the road then. Some days you might them and fighting, other days you might run into, it was light resistance you run into until we had, actually there was a firefight before we had Dachau. There was a group of SS on the road in, and they started shooting at us, so there was a fight there for about an hour. There was actually 12 of us on the front. Now this was actually the front line. Nobody else was in front of us. Just told you there was something strange up at front. I dare say maybe battalion officers knew what was in front of us, but the ordinary troops didn't know. So it was quite a shock to see it. First thing I saw was the railway carriages. I was outside the camp. That was the first thing we saw. And it must have been about 400 bodies in it. And out of the 400, about 400, there was only one alive. That was the first thing. There were open cars, and actually there was snow in some of them, and the bodies were just piled up, and there was blood running out of them, out of the cars. And this one, there was one person alive in it, and the battalion commander, he went and lifted him out, and took him into an aid station. So actually, what happened to him after that, I could not tell you. But the ones that was dead was terrible. They were just piled up like firewood, just thrown up, you know. It was really, and the smell of them was, they might have been lying there for 3 or 4 days, we didn't know. But we heard them in the camp, and then when we moved in through the big gate, we came across, and it was hell in there. Well, there was a lot of milling about first, but we didn't know what to do. And we saw the inmates rushing to the wires, and someone was electrocuted. Everybody was running around, and they were yelling and shouting, and actually they were hugging us and kissing us, and we were giving them some of our hard food and cigarettes, but we couldn't really move. You know, we're just pushing our way through them, where the crowd behind them was pushing to see what was going on. And for about 2 or 3 hours, it was really hell. It was noisy. Everybody was yelling and shouting. You couldn't make yourselves heard, you know. And actually, a few times we had to fire shots into the air to try and control them a bit. There was a wire right round the camp, electric wire right round it, and there was watchtowers. And there was a few guards left in the watchtowers. There was a few of them shot and a few came down. But there was shooting outside. After that, there was some of the SS was trying to escape. Why they stayed there, I don't know. There was a few electrocuted until they got it turned off. But the crowd was pushing them, and you know there was no way we could control them. And everybody was running around and shouting and yelling. And well, there was only maybe the first ones was only about 20 of us, and there was no way we could really control them. Blue and white striped pajamas, and that's all they were dressed in. Some had shoes, and some had cloth wrapped around their feet. And the smell of it was terrible. It was pathetic. And a lot of the guys was actually sick. I was sick for a while. And then after things settled down, say about 3 or 4 hours, things settled down, we started to move about the camp a little. And then we saw more bodies piled up inside the camp. And then we went, well, they tell me the ovens was never used there. But we saw they had ovens there, but they tell me they were never used. But the bodies that was piled up around the camp was something terrible. And they were dying in front of us, actually. Some people was trying to move, and no way had the strength to move. So that went on until they started to give us orders what to do, to try and We had to keep them in the main thing was to keep them in the camp, not let them roam around the country. There was a few got out. Of course, you can't blame them, but then we were worrying about the disease maybe that was in the camp. This is one of the main, typhoid and things like that. One of the main things that the army was afraid to get into the countryside. It was a big camp, and then there were satellite camps, different ones, maybe miles, 2 or 3 miles away from them, doing different things. There was other ones round the town of Dhaka, different places, but this was the main camp. And up on the front of it was "Work makes you free." But how they ever come to decide that, I don't know. Nothing we could do personally, only just try to keep them within the camp. There was nothing, like we had no food with us, only just a couple of rations just, and we gave it to them. And I dare say we maybe killed someone with eating the hard food that we had, the hard biscuits and things like that. I dare say we'd killed some of them too. But the food didn't come into the next day. Now there was a bakery in the town of Dhaka, and some of the officers went and got bread and brought it in, but it was the next morning before they'd done that. Like really, they could do nothing much that day. And then they got the surrender of the camp. There was a German officer come out. I didn't see the actual surrender, but they'd come out to the gate where the assistant divisional commander came down, and he took the surrender there. But that was late on in the afternoon sometime. Only just try to keep them in the camp. That was all we could do. I mean, with nothing with us. I'm talking about infantry is just what they can carry. They had nothing with us at all, so there was nothing we could do to help them. And we just went round more or less. After we got them sort of convinced that they couldn't get out, we started going around the camp and looking at different things around the camp. And then some of them tried to get us sleep. I went into one of the offices, but no way could I sleep. There was 3 companies moved out that night. We were the only company that was left with medical and all starting to come in after that. We were the only company that stayed overnight on it. So then the next morning, they organised a few things in the morning, and then we were pulled out, went on to Munich. There was a bit of a fight in Munich with a few SS, and that was just the last I saw of Dhaka. And I was really glad to get out of it. I could honestly say I've seen and been in hell. But the smell of it was something terrible. But the sight of those people running around, they didn't know what they were really doing either. But they were just glad that they were free. That night we were pulling guard. But when you got a 2 on and 2 off, but you never slept, you just looked for something. We made coffee and had a few rations of our own, but that was all. But I just sat on a chair and dozed just. But that was all. And then I had to get onto tanks the next day. And so you couldn't have slept in that place. Now, time didn't mean anything to us. We'd watches on, but it didn't mean anything. And dates didn't mean anything. And it was somewhere around noon as we left for Munich. And we were told that there was a bit of a fight on in Munich, and that's the reason they rushed the rest of us up to it. And at this time we knew the war was over, and everybody wanted to stay out of the fighting. They were just looking for survival. The last days of the war, just after Dhaka. And we were really busy, and we were busy up until middle of June. Ben was 25. I never talked about Dhaka for years after it. Sometimes I'd awakened up in the middle of the night and I thought I smelt it. And then you realise that you're lying in your bed. But sometimes it does come, or sometimes maybe something triggers it off that you can think about it. Maybe read something in the paper or something on the radio's mentioned, and then you think about it, actually saw in it. Feel very sad about it, that I seen it and went through it. But then afterwards glad that it helped to liberate them. So there was the two different feelings in it. You know, one thing was very bad to see, and then you realise that you helped to liberate the camp that made it one of the good points of the war. I would say it was the best point of the war regarding anything, that you helped to liberate them. It was 47 before I was discharged. Come back, and it was hard to get back. I was down, every day was down the town, I was in bars and drinking, and the wife was kicking up a row with me. And they were wanting me to start work again. And there was one day I went up to work to see some of the guys, and the boss says, "What about starting work?" So I started work then. After about a couple of months, I started work again. Everybody sort of reacted different to it. Some people were sick, and some people never gets over it, and other ones do get over it. And as you said before, some just shuts it out, which has helped me along, just to shut it out altogether. But at times it comes back to you again, and you just start and think about it. And occasionally I lift that book and read a little of it. Don't read an awful lot of it. I just read a little of it and set it down again. I keep it at the bedside. Something triggers it off, and you think about it. Some of the atrocities that happens today, it just takes you back to it, or something else. And as I'm saying before, sometimes I think I can smell it just when I'm waking up. And then the wife will tell me, turn over and go to sleep again.
Well, I was born in Cyprus. I was brought up in Downpatrick, County Down. And I went to school in Downpatrick until I was about 8 years old. Then I went to school in Dublin until I was 17. When I left school, I went to Australia. And I was in Australia for several years, and I was doing this and that and bits and pieces in Australia. And then after Australia, I came back to Europe, and I was just sort of doing bits and pieces around in the different countries. And then I went to London, and I was working for a construction firm in London from, I think it was 85 until about 91. And then after that, I came back home, and I was working at home. And then in 93, I started working for the Red Cross, the Irish Red Cross. And I was seconded to ICRC in Yugoslavia. Well, it's it's a funny story in a way. A friend of mine actually applied to work for the Red Cross, and like he got refused. And then we were chatting about it and everything, and I thought, why not? And I applied, and like I didn't know whether I'd have much chance of getting in, working for them or anything. And like I applied, then I had an interview about a month later, and then I didn't hear anything from them for, must have been about 2 months. And like I was away at the time in Germany, and I came back, and I had this message to say that they'd been trying to contact me. Literally the day I'd left for Germany, they'd been trying to contact me. And it was just asking me if I would go and work in Yugoslavia for them. And I just sort of sat there, and I remember thinking, like, do I really want to do this? And I wasn't sure. And I went down and I saw them, and I thought, okay, why not? And originally it was like just a couple of months I was to go to Yugoslavia. And I went there, and they extended my contract a bit longer, and I was in Yugoslavia at that time for about 6 months. And then I sort of decided after the 6 months, okay, enough was enough. I wanted to go back to normality. And I came home, and I remember I went on holidays for sort of 2 weeks. And when I came back, and I was coming back through Dublin, and I went in to see the Red Cross, and suddenly, like, they were offering me to go to Rwanda or Zaire or one of the countries around. And, like, I thought about it, and then a friend of mine from Geneva rang me and asked me to go. And I said, okay, I'll go. But once again, it was thinking only a couple of months. And I left in June 94, flew to Nairobi, and we went to the headquarters of the ICRC in Nairobi, and we had to wait to decide where we were going to be positioned, because what they were trying to do was position people, because they guessed that with the war going on in Rwanda at the time, the RPF getting closer and closer to Kigali, there was going to be some exodus, and they were trying to position us in different countries so we could react. As the refugees came out, we would have food and everything, supplies and everything like this. Before I actually went, there had been the genocide in Rwanda, and this had taken place from approximately April right through until July. And there had been between 500,000 to 1 million people murdered in different parts of Rwanda, and under different circumstances. And then you'd had the propaganda from the government, the radio, like it was all, like everybody knew about the radio, what had happened, that they had been making these announcements on the radio that they should clean their villages, they should get rid of the people who were working with the Tutsis, who were working against the government. And like, you have to remember that it wasn't only Tutsis that got killed, it was Hutus, and anybody that wasn't pro-government were the people that got killed. And the way it happened was that it wasn't just one individual person did the killing, it was like all the people in the village were roped in to do it together, so that there was a community involvement. And this all affected when I arrived, like when the actual RPF started coming into the country. The reason why there was such a mass exodus was because of this. Because, like, okay, there were lots of people in the villages who didn't do anything, but they were roped into it like they were spectators, and they were made to be part of it by that. And so that they ran. As soon as they knew that the Tutsi army, which was the RPF, were coming in, they ran. And like, it was million people who came out of the country. And like, through the region I was working in was in Goma. We had something like between 300,000 to 500,000 people come through that area. Like, not all of them stayed. Initially, we had about 250,000 people who stayed in that area. Some of them went further down, and some of them actually went into Burundi, different places. And you had exodus on all directions. The people coming out, initially the people who came from close, like to the border, they were able to bring quite a large stock of food and things like this. But the people who had to come from further, from sort of Kigali direction, they just came literally with a mat, a pot, and like, we actually had we called them, like, it's not a very nice term, but we called them mattress heads, because you literally saw thousands of women coming with these mattresses, like straw mattresses, and they were sitting like this with a pot on top. And that's what you saw. And like, there were just thousands and thousands of people, and their children running around, and they were just coming out. And like, you had the all civilians, you had the military, everything just running.
Did they bring food with
very, very small quantities of food. Like, most people would bring enough food to survive maybe 3-4 days, because like they literally left their homes in the middle of the night and ran, because you had the propaganda machine of the former government turning around and saying that when the RPF came into the village, they were going to kill everybody. And this is what happened. And so you had a mass exodus, like people just ran. Very, very few people stayed behind. Some elderly who just couldn't move. That was about it. I remember we were all sitting there and we didn't know what to do. And this is like we had a vast amount of food stored in our warehouses, and this had been pre-positioned by some of our people from Nairobi. But the problem was, how do you react to maybe 250,000 people? And like some of them with severe dysentery, who just arrive like in a small town like Goma and just occupy the whole town. There was no way you could do a feeding program within the town. You had disease spreading so quickly that like there was nothing you could do. And like I just remember like we sat literally for 2 days trying to help move bodies, people who were dying and things like this. And that's the reaction we had at the start. And during that time, like the relief department, which is the people who supply food and water, we tried to figure out how we could react to this. Like, and we just literally sat and decided, okay, the first thing we have to do is move the people out of the town, because the disease was spreading, the local inhabitants, everything. It would have been a complete disaster. So what we did was we set up feeding points going out of the town past the airport at, first of all, 5 kilometers, then 10 kilometers, then 25 kilometers. And what we did was at the first few points was only food we supplied. The further points we supplied some food, plus plastic sheeting and blankets, and water cans for carrying water and things like this. And that was our plan, just to get the people out. And literally, we set up camps at 25 kilometers. And one of the first camp we set up was Kabongo. And we set up a camp. Literally, we said to the people, you live on this side, the toilet is on that side of the road. And that's what we did. And like we tried to supply food, and we saw that it just wasn't going to work the way we were doing it. And we literally went back to our base camp. We got in contact with some members of the former Red Cross from Rwanda, and we got to talk to them. And we had literally 2 days of discussions, because we just couldn't figure out how to react. And we just talked literally for 2 days. And then what we did was we went up to the camp, and we got the leaders from the different communes, and we talked to them and asked them how the camp had been, they were organizing the camp. And it turned out that the Rwandese are very organized people. They literally put stickers on the side of the road which said, this is the commune. Well, along the road, you would have each commune would have their name. And then as you went back, you would have the villages from the commune. And they were really well organized. And the Burgmaster, he would always stand, like the Burgmaster is the community leader, he would stand up the front. And as the people came past, they would recognize the signs for their commune, and they would go into that place, and they would join with the rest of their families. So the way we worked it was that we got all the Burgmasters together, and we talked to them, and we set up a 7-day rota, and we fed people for a month's ration, because there were so many people, like we could average, I think it was about 35,000 people a day, and that's what we fed. And like it was half ration, because that's all we could afford, and We also worked out that we needed water. So we arranged with other organizations literally to have a convoy going straight from Lake Kivu up to the camp. And this went on all day and night, literally, because you had 250,000 people who needed water, and you had maybe 30, 40 vehicles at the time, and they just pumped the water straight out of Lake Kivu and took it up. And the advantage about Kivu is because the volcano goes underneath and the water is purified by the volcano. So we didn't have to purify the water, anything. It was so simple. You just drove down, put the pipe in, sucked the water up, took it up to the camps, put it in bladders all around the camp. And at the start, we could never fill the bladders up, because as soon as we put the water in the bladders, they were empty. Literally, people were taking the water as we brought it up. And it took maybe 2 weeks till we got to the situation where the bladders became full, and then people would just take as they needed. And we didn't have the big problem of water after that. And once that was solved, the actual death rate within the camps went down, because the main killer was dysentery within the camps. We had thousands of people dying every day, like 2,000-3,000 people every day. And you had organizations like Goal and Chokra who literally picked the bodies up from the side of the road and had to bury them in mass graves. The atmosphere in the camps, at the start, because of I would say the first 3 weeks, it was very bad, because there were children dying, there were elderly people dying, and thousands of people dying every day. And it was nervous, it was tense. The former Rwandan soldiers, they were all around the camp, and they were the main disruptors, and any problems that were had on the camp, especially during distribution and things like this, they used to wait until most of the food had been handed out, and then they used to come down and try and steal it. And this used to cause a riot for us, and it was really dangerous. I was involved with the camps right up until sort of September. And then what happened was the Federation of the Red Cross took over the camps. And those camps were running for another 2 years after that. I was part of the initial team in the northwest of Rwanda that we went in to do the survey on the conditions in Rwanda, how many people were left in the different communes. And I did the food and housing part of the survey, and water. And we just went into the villages, and we seen that, okay, in certain villages, you literally had 1 or 2 people left. And in other villages, there might not have been any problems ever. You could go into some of the mountain villages, and the whole village was there. They had, there was one village we came across, they hadn't even realized that there had been a genocide. They were a small little village right up in the mountains. They're pygmies, and they lived very isolated. They didn't really intermix. This village, they didn't even know there had been a genocide. They didn't even know that the government had changed. And this was this in isolated areas was something you discovered, that it never got there. They didn't have radios. And then other villages, you would have maybe 2 or 3 people, then maybe 10 people in another one, and it just depended on each place. And what happened was that the RPF set up a military government all around the country. And the military people took positions, like the Burgmas, head of a commune and things like this, were all military at one stage. And it wasn't until the people began to come back that they began to hand over gradually the positions back to the normal people. But always, in key areas, the position was never given back to a Hutu that was from the former government. It would always have to be a supporter of the RPF that had come in. And that's just the way it worked. In the villages where you had the genocide occur, in a lot of the churches and the schools, the bodies were still there from the genocide, where the people had been rounded up and put into the churches or into the houses and burnt. And like there had been no hiding process. They just left everything. And okay, I don't know whether in time, if the RPF hadn't come in so quickly, whether it would have been sort of tried to brush it under the carpet, but it really gave the view that it was there to be seen. And this is what was going to happen to anybody who was against the government. And that's the way it looked to us, that it was a picture so that the whole country knew the reason why the genocide had happened, and this was a reminder. And that's the way it seemed to us when we were coming into the villages, that it had been left on purpose so that there was no debate amongst the people, that they were all involved with it, and it would always be them as a whole. Nearly every town, village that had a situation like that, they set up a memorial. And they used the skulls as the memorial in a lot of situations, where you can go today and you can go into some of these villages, and it's a reminder of what happened. And it's a very stark reminder. Like you have plaques written up in French and English that will tell you what happened. And the skulls are there to remind people that this was what a genocide is and what happened. And it's very, very poignant reminders to people that these things have happened and they're not to be forgotten. You have a process in different countries where you have two groups fighting each other. You have in Rwanda, you had genocide, major genocide. Yugoslavia, you had major genocide. You go to Congo now, Democratic Republic of Congo, you're still having this. You're having tribal wars where they are massacring villages. And the reason it goes on is because nobody is there to stop them. There has to be a mediator in a way, because one sees these are long-running disputes, and they don't just happen today. They've been going on, a lot of these things, since independence of the country, where you had a division of power, which was done by the colonial power, and they've given this group power, and this group have got nothing. And quite often what happens is the group that got power are the minority, and the majority come in to take over, and then it's just open warfare. And because neither group wants to give in and wants to give up the power once they got it. And because of the atrocities that have been committed for year after year after year, they can't resolve it. There has to be a mediator come in to help resolve these problems. People are people. They fight with each other. But one of the things I've learned is that given the opportunity, without the propaganda, without certain groups agitating, people can be living together without any problems at all. Some people will forgive, some people won't. And you have to understand that. But for a community to come together again, when you have the people who were involved in the genocide returning, you have people who were directly involved with the killing. You have bystanders who watched it. They have to differentiate between the two in a way. There's a guilt feeling no matter what, because they watched it, they were drawn into it. But you have to have a total forgiveness. Sometimes, somebody's involved with pushing them into a church. They're considered to be murderers. And they are murderers because of their involvement. But the process within Rwanda has been that some of these people have now been forgiven by the community, and the community get together and they talk about it, And they tried to forgive and to build. And it's the only way that there has to be a huge forgiveness on both sides. So you have anger on both sides, and it's just trying to bring the people together and get them to understand that their only future is together.
No, my father was born in Rwanda, a place called Nyanza. And in '59, when he was a teenage boy, that's whenever he left Rwanda, go to Zaire, and grew up there, get an adult, and get married in Zaire. He just in '59, again, it was a war in Rwanda, and many of his tribe had to move out. As we know, many went to Tanzania. My mom's side went to Burundi, but him went towards Zaire, and that's where we were born. He met my mom in a place called Bukavu in south, and he had 2 kids, a boy and a daughter. And then he moved to Goma, and that's where I was born with my other sister. And from there, he just moved on. If the business is not working to one place, they keep, going to different. And he ended up going to a place called Ruchuru. I was born in Goma and grew up there until '94 when I came to Rwanda, after just, what happens in Rwanda. It was hard because, you leave your place you were born, you grow up, you went to school with your friends, and turn back to you and said, look, what are you still doing here? Your country is next door. Why don't you pack your stuff and go? And you look to them and said, why do you have to go to a place I'd never been? I don't know. Yes, it's Rwanda, but I don't want to go. This is my home. And they said, no, you're not more welcome here. And it was just unbelievable. But we had to think about it and said, these people, they're talking, it's truth. That's where your daddy came from, and that's where you come from. You'll never be a Zairian. People who have been, who has killed, they had to leave Rwanda with no choice because they knew they would be kept or put in prison or be killed. And when they came towards Zaire, that's when they found us. And hard enough to believe, when they see us as the same face, the same tribe, they couldn't believe we're still alive. And even though they were on the road, dying with, hunger and illness, they could just try again to do the same thing they did in Rwanda. And for us, we couldn't believe it. And that became really scary for us. And we thought, it's not safe for us anymore because there wasn't government to look, to keep an eye on you or anybody to protect you. And for me, I was a Christian. Then I went to to the elder of the church. I said to pray for me because I really didn't know what to do. And they said to me, Pela, just remember, Rwanda is where your daddy came from, and we can't stop you to go back. Just the Lord is everywhere, and He's going to protect you there. We can't guarantee you to stay in Zaire because we're not beside you. We can't do nothing else. And that's whenever I said, that's it. I had Ananda, my first daughter then, and put her on my back and crossed the border. And that was tough. That was really hard because you just go in a place you've never been in your life. Even, your dad came from, sure, there wasn't nothing for you there. You just have to go and survive. But one thing was good for me because I knew I would be safe in Rwanda because of the military, the RPF, which are all around. And I knew there would be, at least somebody, would be out in the country and make sure somebody doesn't do those kind of stuff. And that's what it brought me to Rwanda. I moved on my own again because my father was a bit far from where I was. And for me, I traveled on my own, and I couldn't get to the other village to get my father with his wife and the kids, because on the road there was so many of, like troubles. Because, if you travel, they will get you in a car, they will get you out, and they will do whatever they think. And you just have to stay put and pray to the Lord, keep them safe and bring them to me, however you can. And I crossed the border on my own, but eventually my father was able to come towards Goma, and they stayed in one of his house until I heard the news. I crossed the border and, tried to start the transport for them and bring them closer to where I was then, in Rwanda. And then there was 1 year whenever we were in Zaire, after just, the trouble. And you don't go far away. You just, Gisenyi is the border for Goma and the Ruhengeri. You just go at the closest you can until I knew that her daddy's family has been to Ruhengeri, and that's be like 50 miles away. And they heard that I crossed the border. They said, look, why don't you join us and be with us here? That's whenever I went to Ruhengeri and settled with them for a while, and just thinking how you go to survive, and then I was looking for the job, and that's whenever I saw this Irish Red Cross warehouse and the offices. And I talked to my friend, a girl I knew from Goma. She was already in the same village. And we said, look, we need to do something. And she said, what can we do? She said, there's, I think, few jobs around. And then I said to her, but these people only speak English. How would you go to tell, And she said, sure, we'll see. We just take courage and go. And we walked to the Red Cross warehouse, and we met this girl from Switzerland. And she says, oh, this is not the place, you should come look for a job. So where else can we go? But that speaks in French. And they says, okay, you keep going. And we get to this warehouse, and this man was standing at the gate, and he said to us, oh, you were looking for the wrong place. And we said, why is that? He says, because the job is all done. They're not looking for more staff anymore. Is everything gone? We said, is that true? He says, yes. And it's because this guy, when he sees us, he straight away knows who we are, and he just ignores. I said, there's no chance for you. As we stand, we're just interceding, we're praying, Lord, we just can't go back. At least give us a chance, another chance to go in the gate, to the office. And the man keep arguing for us. We just say, okay, we'll stand here until we, something happens. And in a second, we saw Land Cruiser was behind, and the guy was sitting in it, and the driver was driving, and the man didn't have a choice. He had to open the gate wide, and we just walked in like a queens, and and the car was just behind us, and we follow. And as we stand at the door, and Gary asked this other driver, he was a Rwandan man, he says, what are these girls looking here, for? And he came and asked us, why are you here? We said, job. We didn't have clue, job even in English. I punched this, I said, what is now job in English? He says, I think that's the one, I said, okay, job. And we didn't know what the answer will be. But we saw Gary speaking on a mobile, or whatever you call them. And actually was somebody in a field where they do distribution. He just called that, hello, we need 2 people, emergencies, really, as we're standing there. And wow, and we saw Dio, who hit, he said, Louis, he says, you girl and you just follow me. And that was it. We follow him. We didn't know where we were going, but we just follow him. And he said, okay, enter to the car. In the same Land Cruiser, we pop in, we sat. And we went straight to the distribution field. And we start our job the same time. It was was fantastic. And that's how I met Gary then. I didn't speak to him, but I get to know him while we were walking. Yeah. And the more we get to know each other, the more we fell in love and decided to get married. And we came to Northern Ireland. Yeah. We managed to get the houses which the Rwandanese people who have been run away to go towards Goma have left empty. The doors are not locked. Most of them, they are smashed, and most of the people have been killed because of the grenade. I don't know how you call them, the grenade. They've left them in the houses because they knew if people are coming back to Rwanda, these things will blow up, and many people have been killed about of those things. People who I knew, people who were my neighbors, you know, I knew they'd been killed because coming towards Rwanda, but it wasn't safe also. But you didn't have a choice. You just have to go and, you know, try to fit in and, yeah, try to survive. They were all killed, my grannies, you know, my cousins. They were no more there. And I remember my uncle who was in a place called Lubumbashi. He was a doctor in Lubumbashi. He came back and he saw his mom's body, which wasn't rotten completely. And they saw the clothes she used to wear, you know, and that's just too much to take in, you know. But my father, he died in Rwanda, you know, and he just died by cancer. And my mother died in '93 before her mother was killed. And also, we look at that situation. Losing your mother is an awful thing, but, and again, it could be harder if she was still alive and she knew that, you know, oh, her daddy, her mother was killed and she couldn't do nothing else, you know, to help. That would be again more harder. But she died of cancer also in Goma. And it's just things we look back, we said, why these things happen to us? But despite everything, I'm a Christian and born-again Christian. I think God knows everything, and He really allowed those things to happen, and He knows why. We can't just explain it, you know. And for me as a believer, I said, it was awful, but there's something good came from it, for sure. I don't know anybody else what they will think, but for me, I see that God has His hand in Rwanda, because when I go back to Rwanda in '97, when my daddy was dying, it was tense. You couldn't take any bus at all. You couldn't go to different, you know, villages because they've been killing every time. They burned the buses in the middle of the road. They will come to your house, so like you're watching football with other people, they will just kill everybody in the house. But in '99, I went back again, and I see changes every time I go back. And I see people, now they're trying to work together. As a few years before genocide, people wouldn't talk to each other, you know. And for me, whenever I see '99, when I went back, I see like a Hutus who came back from, you know, from Rwanda after they ran to Goma. They are next door neighbor. And you see them, and you remember that they throw stone at you, they run behind you, try to catch you, to kill you if they can. And you can always pass in front of the house and say, good morning in Kinyarwanda, and they will say good morning, you know, just to try to see that you can always work things out, you can try to be together, you can just forgive each other no matter what, because this is our country. This is for all of us. It's not just for Tutsis, it's not just for Hutus. And when I see things like that, it really brings me joy, because I see God is in action, really He is. And we can only forgive each other to look for the best.